Hi everyone out there, welcome back to the channel, Eighth Wonder Investing, where compounding is the eighth wonder of the world. Today I'd like to cover another one of Phil Town's valuation methods, one of the Phil 3, and that is payback time. Phil has a whole book dedicated to the concept of payback time. That's the title of the book. It's his second book out of the 3 that he's written. I've always said, having read all 3, that the latest, Invested, that he wrote with his daughter is the better of the 3 because it draws on and updates the knowledge in the first 2 books. And it makes some more modern changes. But the concept of payback time, detailed in the second book, is very interesting and it's definitely worth a read. So yeah, what is payback time? So let me set the scene a bit. Phil Town talks about private versus public businesses when he talks about payback time. Normally, a private business, on average, will sell for 7 to 8 times earnings. This is normally what happens, apparently. Whereas in the public markets, it's more normal for companies to sell for more than that, or trade at double that of a PE of 15, so 15 times their earnings on average. The concept is, if we can buy a public business for a private company price, then this is a good deal. So that's, there's a lot more expanding to do on that, but that's this is kind of where the birth of the idea. As with many of these ideas from Phil Town, they are inspired by arguably the greatest of all time, Warren Buffett. So I mentioned companies selling at multiples of their earnings just now, but what payback time focuses heavily on is not earnings, which can be manipulated and are not the best reflection of the cash a business produces, but instead it focuses heavily on free cash flow. As Warren Buffett says, intrinsic value is the number that if you were all knowing about the future and you could predict all the cash, very important there, that the business would give you between now and Judgment Day, if you discount that back at a proper discount rate, that number that you end up with is what the intrinsic value of a business is. And you'll notice Warren Buffett says cash, not net income or earnings or EBITDA, which Charlie Munger has had some rude things to say about in the past, which is hilarious, I find. But I certainly don't want to be swearing here on YouTube, so I won't be repeating them. So yeah, Warren talks about cash, and this is why for payback time, and to be honest, in pretty much all value investing, we focus heavily on cash, and for payback time, it's free cash flow that we're going to focus on. So, as you can imagine, one of the first things to do is to calculate free cash flow. As with a lot of things, when supplying the inputs to various company valuation methods, you want to look at historically and reasonably accurate values, and you want them to be historical and reasonable when you're plugging them in, and you're not using any outliers, because that can really throw off your end figure. Believe me, I nearly bought a business when it was based. So I was basing my whole buy price on valuations that I didn't realize that were an outlier. Luckily, I realized this, but it taught me a very valuable lesson to always look at a long history of how different company financials have grown over time, so you can see the trends and the outliers. Don't get me wrong, there may be perfectly valid reasons for those outliers, but you need to know that they're there and factor that in somehow, whether you ignore them or you just understand that they're there and understand the reason why. Anyway, to calculate free cash flow, which unfortunately is not a line in the financial statements, and it is not calculated for us, we need 2 things. And where you'll be looking for these 2 numbers is the cash flow statement. This is where we spend a lot of time, the cash flow statement. We need operating cash flow from there. So we need the operating cash flow, and then we turn that into free cash flow by subtracting capital expenditure, or CapEx. So free cash flow equals operating cash flow minus capital expenditure. The cash flow statement has 3 sections. Operations, there's an operating section, investing section, and a financing section. Operating cash flow can be found as part of the first section, normally at the bottom, and CapEx can be found just below it at the top of the second section, to do with investing. It will almost always be called something like purchases of property, plant, and equipment. The key here is to get historically reasonable numbers for each of these. Okay, then you take CapEx away from operating cash flow, and you end up with free cash flow. So now we're armed with a free cash flow figure that we're confident in, and we can apply this to the next step in the process. But in order to be able to apply it to the next step in the process, we first need to smash the like button and subscribe. And then, more importantly, we need to come up with the growth rate. You'll hear Phil Town, and especially Danielle Town, as she came up with this name. You'll hear them call this growth rate the Windage Growth Rate, and this is kind of akin to how you would try and take into account windage when you're shooting a gun. You don't know exactly how it will affect the bullet's trajectory, but you can take in a few factors and make an educated prediction and adjust accordingly. It is important that you're not too optimistic with this growth rate, and it must be reasonably achievable based on historical growth and some key numbers. We'll go more into those key numbers in a moment. So, combined with analyst predictions of how the company is expected to grow going forward, and your own best guess, you can come up with an overall growth rate for the company, the Windage Growth Rate. So, some key numbers that you can look at for this to try and help you determine the Windage Growth Rate. You can look at the growth of revenue, earnings, book value plus dividends, and operating cash flow. Those are good ones to start with, and what is taught in Phil and Danielle's book. I think you should also look at return on invested capital, as this is one of the single most important numbers to look at when valuing a company and assessing its efficiency at returning cash to you as a function of its invested capital. So this takes into account debt as well. So it's quite good. Ultimately, the windage is a personal judgment based on your own research. It's not an exact science, but thankfully we don't need it to be. Warren Buffett didn't become one of the richest people by whipping out Excel and getting something right to the 3rd decimal place. The next step is all about how that free cash flow grows into the future, because it will, and we want our valuation to reflect that growth. I can show you some Excel formulas to work this out, but it can be done by hand as well. But essentially, you want to grow the free cash flow by your windage growth rate that we talked about before by X number of years, which would depend on what kind of payback time you're doing, and then you add them all up. You sum up those. Say it's for 6 years. You sum those grown free cash flow figures. You sum them up for those 6 years, and you'll end up with the amount of time it will take you to get all your money back should you purchase the whole company for that price in 6 years. Now let me touch briefly on how many years to go out with this. In the books, Phil Town talks about 8 years, an 8-year payback time. So he talks about wanting to buy the company at a price where essentially you're paid back in 8 years with the growth of free cash flow. This means, you would make the calculation over an 8-year period, and that would be your buy price. Now, I have listened and watched pretty much every piece of YouTube and podcast content that that Phil has put out. I've also attended his workshop, and he has mentioned multiple times that 8 years is good, but he aims for a 6-year payback time, and it's the 6-year payback time that is the great buy price you can end up with. But it is really just a variable in your valuation method. The calculation itself, at its core, doesn't change. So now I'll show you how you can do the calculation with all the elements we now have that we've just collated together. So over here in the spreadsheet, so how you might do these calculations. We'll just go through a couple of examples. One, a manual way of doing the calculation, and then kind of an all-in-one formula for it. So I'm just going to make some assumptions here. Windage growth rate 15%, and shares outstanding 10,000. And we'll start with our year zero, our starting point. Assume we've calculated our free cash flow. We're just going to say 10,000 right off the bat. So that's our starting point, and then we want to grow that free cash flow by our windage growth rate. So we just take our free cash flow times by 1 plus our growth rate, and I'll lock that in. And we take that out. Hang on a sec. Times didn't go in there. There we go. What have I done wrong there? B5. Okay, sorry about that. So that is 11,500, which is 15% of 10,000. But then we drag that across. We've got 8 years. But this is essentially what a 6-year payback time would be in this column, and then J would be the 8-year payback time. So this is how our free cash flow grows at 15%. So after 8 years, we're at 30,000 free cash flow. We've got shares outstanding 10,000. So what we're interested in is not working out what the free cash flow is on year 6 or year 8 and then doing some calculation on that. We're interested on how much cumulatively we will get based on, say, we're doing a 6-year payback time, how much cumulatively we'll have after those 6 years. So we need to do a sum. We'll start here. We'll lock that one in, and then not lock that one in. That's that B5 again. B5. And we'll drag that out. So for a 6-year payback time, we would have cumulatively accumulated over 6 years $110,000 in free cash flow, or whatever currency that the financial statements are based in. For an 8-year payback time, 167, well, 168 nearly. So now to calculate the price, we take our cumulative free cash flow figure and divide by our shares outstanding. Lock that in. Essentially, for a 6-year payback time, for the price would be 11, call it dollars, that we would buy that at. And if we bought the company at $11 a share, based on our assumptions, we will be paid back in free cash flow in 6 years in this column. Or if we bought it at $16.8 a share, I probably shouldn't put the decimal places in because it's not an exact science, but you get the idea. Say $17 a share will roughly be paid back in 8 years. This is the 6-year payback time is the magic one. That's the one to aim for a really good valuation on the payback time. And if you want a formula that does it all for you, this is it basically. I don't know if I can make that any bigger. Hang on. There we go. Oh, we're going. Yeah, we're way too big now. So basically, sum product, and then the first item that you want to add in is your free cash flow, and then you want to multiply that by you need to start the power formula, and then B4 plus 1 is basically your growth rate plus 1. So it's, say it's 15%, you're looking to have 115% in there basically. And then in this array formula, this array here, you put in the number. Say you're doing a 6-year payback time, you would put in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If you're doing an 8 one, you would just add a 7 and an 8 on there, basically. So once you plug that in, you essentially get exactly the same as what we've got over here for the 6-year payback time. So that's it, the payback time valuation method. You can't go wrong with a correctly calculated 6-year payback time. It's really a good method, and it takes into account free cash flow. So it's not, capital expenditure minus maintenance capex. It just takes the whole of capital expenditure and takes that away from operating cash flow, and then it's really based on the heart of the cash flow that's coming out of the business, the free cash flow. So it's a good method to use, to learn and apply. So if you have any questions, I would love to hear them in the comments below. With that said, I'll let you get back to your day. I hope this information was really useful. It's a good one, the payback time. And I'll catch you on the next one. Take care.